Good evening. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the 2024 J.B. and Maurice C. Shapiro Annual Lecture at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. My name is Lisa Leff, and I'm the director of the museum's Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies. And it's truly a pleasure to welcome you all here for this evening's program. Let me begin this evening with a thank you to the J.B. and Maurice C. Shapiro Charitable Trust. This trust enables the Mandel Center to bring a distinguished scholar to the museum every year in order to conduct innovative research about the Holocaust and allows us to disseminate their knowledge to the public. Tonight's speaker was our 2022-2023 Shapiro Senior Scholar in Residence, Dr. Havi Dreifuss. And let me begin actually with a personal note to say what a true pleasure it was to have her here then, and what a pleasure it is to have her back with us this week for this lecture. But now let me introduce her. Dr. Havi Dreifuss is a professor in the Department of Jewish History at Tel Aviv University, where she also heads the Institute for the History of Polish Jewry and Israel-Poland Relations. She also leads the Center for Research on the Holocaust in Poland at the International Institute for Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem. From those important positions, Havi has trained many graduate students directly. She tells me she has 12 working with her right now. She has also advised countless others in Israel and, I must say, around the world. She herself, as you will hear tonight, is a specialist on Polish Jews, but through her students, her impact on the field has been vast. We here at the museum have turned to her countless times for her knowledge and her sage advice on all sorts of pressing scholarly questions, and I know we will be continuing to do so in the years to come. Havi is the author of numerous publications, including Relations Between Jews and Poles, The Jewish Perspective, which was published in 2012, and also Warsaw Ghetto, The End, which was published in Hebrew in 2018 and is currently being translated into English as well as Polish. As these publications reflect, Havi is particularly interested in changes to Jewish social life during the period of persecution, as well as changes in relations between Jews and Poles. But at the same time, she has also done path-breaking work in the very understudied area of Jewish religious life during the Holocaust, for which she has tapped archival materials that very few of us have ever seen. And it's this topic that she'll be talking with us about tonight. The talk is entitled, Unveiling the Unexplored, Orthodox Jews in Poland During the Holocaust. And please stay because after Havi's talk, my colleague, Dr. Betsy Anthony, the director of our Visiting Scholars program, will moderate a question and answer period with Havi. And now let me welcome her to the stage, Havi.
Thank you so much, dear Lisa, for your kind introduction, and more importantly, for the unwavering support I have received from you and from the many friends at the Mandel Center of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum over the years. The Mandel Center, along with its incredible staff, has supported my work for years, and I'm profoundly grateful for your leadership and friendship. I would also like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Betsy Anthony for her continued support and friendship, and to Mrs. Jocelyn Barrett, without whom this evening event would not have been possible. The brainstorming session and discussions I have had with many of my friends in the Mandel Center, some of who are now scattered around the world, have shaped the ideas I will present tonight, and I apologize for not mentioning any names because for sure I will forget some. On a more personal note, I feel compelled to extend my gratitude for the extraordinary support I received during a particularly challenging time in my life. During my stay at the center, I was diagnosed with cancer. As you can see, I'm recovering well, thanks God, and I'm beyond grateful for the assistance and care extended to me throughout that period. This lecture, which comes more than a year later than originally planned, stands as a testament to the flexibility, understanding, and encouragement of this remarkable academic community. However, it is important to acknowledge that this lecture takes place during deeply troubling times for Israel, the Jewish people, and much of the Western world. Just a week ago, we marked 23 years since the tragedy of 9/11. The orchestrated massacre of October 7th on Simchat Torah stands as the deadliest assault on Jews since the Holocaust. The war that had followed had caused unimaginable suffering, sending shockwaves across the globe. While October 7th is not the Holocaust and Hamas is not the Nazis, this atrocity serves as a painful reminder to the persistence of anti-Jewish ideologies. It resurfaces in ways that challenge us deeply, reminding us that the past is not as distant as we might hope. The fight against hatred and bigotry remains urgent and ongoing. With this context set, I would now like to move to the content of my today's lecture, and the image chosen as an invitation to this event from the museum collection shows Rabbi Yechiel Teitelbaum, the elderly rabbi of Kolboshoba, forced to pose in his prayer shawl and tefillin in front of his ghetto home. At first glance, this might appear as a simple documentation of a traditional Jewish leader. However, on a closer look, it becomes clear that this is a stage photograph. The improperly placed tefillin and the overall setting suggest this is not merely a documentation of pity, but rather a manipulation designed for Nazi purposes. We will revisit this image later as it symbolizes our topic, unveiling the unexplored Orthodox Jews in Poland during the Holocaust. This topic holds tremendous importance not only because Orthodox Jews comprise about a third of Polish Jewry, close to 1 million Jews, but also because of the impact their way of life had on Jews who were not necessarily Orthodox. The Orthodox community in Poland, while distinct, was deeply intertwined with broader Jewish society, and many non-Orthodox Jews turned to Orthodox institutions for key life events such as marriage or burial, and other form their own Jewish identity in relation or opposition to Orthodoxy. Yet, the significance of the Orthodox Jewry during the Holocaust extends beyond the Jewish community itself. Nazi ideology specifically targeted Orthodox Jews and used them as tools of propaganda. Moreover, as evidenced by the documents such as Heydrich Schnellbrief of September 21st, 1939, rabbis were labeled as key leaders of the Jewish communities. Thus, Orthodox experience during the Holocaust, an under-researched topic, can shed light on various crucial issues. However, I would argue that it offers us much more than that. It serves as a valuable prism through which we understand both individual and communal life during the Holocaust. In fact, I contend that Orthodox experience is essential for addressing border central themes in Holocaust studies. In the first part of my lecture, I will focus on the early weeks of the Nazi occupation of Poland and the initial encounters between German and Orthodox Polish Jews. Studying the Holocaust, often the discussion quickly shifts to the ghetto and concentration camps. However, by examining the experiences of Orthodox Jewry, I aim to highlight the devastating effect of in the beginning of the war, both personal and communal. Only later, I will move on to a brief exploration of how Orthodox life can contribute to other discussions as leadership dynamic, Jewish youth, and rescue efforts. violence and humiliation. With the Nazi occupation of Poland, Polish Jews, especially those who appeared visibly Jewish or held position of respect within the community, were subjected to extreme violence and public humiliation. To many Germans, those Polish Jews resembled the grotesque stereotype that they had seen in the propaganda like their streamer. Rabbi Segal, Rabbi Treisman, and the Rebbe of Sochotchov were among those who were brutally humiliated by the German in Lodz, and Rabbi Segal is the one that you can see here photoed by the Germans. In Krakow, Rabbi Shabtai Rappaport was forced by the Germans to immerse himself in a barrel of exterminates, and Rabbi Yeshayahu Kalish of Amshinov Pshischa told his associates after his beard and sidelock were cut off that he saw this act as a removal of the divine image from his face. He added, "What good shall my life do me?" 2 weeks later, he died at the age of 74, at the age of 74. The personal crisis is well documented in contemporary accounts as in Ringelblum Archive. Frankel from Radomsko, for instance, provides a horrifying depiction of the Black Tuesday on September 12, 1939, when Jews were forced to report to what was described as forced labor. In practice, the German made them sing, dance, and perform physical exercise while being beaten. Their tzitzit, their traditional clothing, were burned, and their beards were violently cut off. According to Frankel, Jews were humiliated by being dunked into barrels and emerged from them with their hair shaved, soaked in water, tears, and blood. He also wrote that one Hasidic Jew, unable to withstand the degradation, went mad and committed suicide following this torment. Indeed, a particular egregious form of abuse involved the public shaving of beards, often accompanied by physical violence, as reflected in both visual and written documentation. Eliezer Cohen's account from Chelm provides a vivid description of this mass degradation. And I'm just showing a few of those photos. I will refer to those visual documentation later on. As soon as the Germans entered the city, says Cohen, their first attack was on the beards of the religious Jews. They subjected them to cutting, burning, trimming, and plunking, intending to destroy the religious sentiment of observant Jews. The cutting of beards was done on a mass scale. They plunked the beards of many Jews, sometimes even tearing the beard along with flesh. Then Cohen offers a particularly horrifying account of the capture, torture, and humiliation of the town's rabbi. His beard was forcibly shaved off, and he was made to push car and clean horse manure from the market with his bare hands. In a final act of degradation, the German forced him to collect the manure in his hat and wear it on his head. Following this cruel display, the torment continued as the Germans turned back their attention to the rest of the community. They cut, plunked, and tore beard with their hands. For those with smaller beards, the flesh was cut with dagger along with a beard. Some had their beards set on fire and were dragged around with burning beards and had water constantly poured on them. According to Cohen, since this took place at the beginning of the winter, many Jews caught cold and fell ill. The documentation of those events, though incomplete, offer us a glimpse into the widespread nature of those atrocities. Visual records, many of which are now preserved in archive, including those of the museum, depict SS, SD, and Wehrmacht forces actively participating in those acts of humiliation, as well as the responses of the local population. In some instances, we can identify the location, and in some cases, we even know who are the individual Jewish victims. Yet in many cases, those crucial details have lost to history. What remains, however, is the urgent need to better understand the overwhelming impact those acts had on the Jews and their communities. First of all, the personal crisis. In a particular poignant testimony from Rabbi Shlomo David Kahana's son regarding the trauma his father endured, we hear about a man who had long been the pillar that upheld the entire household against the foreign winds blowing. Those are the secular winds. Until the wicked ones came and brought down the entire house. When the wicked Nazi arrived, they diminished the stature and stripped him of his dignity. On the very first day of the rule, they attacked his home, beat and wounded him, spat his face, and even plucked out his graying beard. And in that terrible moment, his posture sank and his spirit was nearly broken, not because of himself, but because of the household had collapsed, and he was powerless to help in any way. Rabbi Kahana successfully escaped occupied Europe and passed away in Jerusalem in 1953. But others stayed in Warsaw and endured further atrocities, and those photos are from Warsaw. Similar reference to the personal breakdown is echoed in the word of the Piaseczna Rebbe in his sermon delivered on Parashat Toldot, that is November 11th, 1939, reflecting on the verse, "And the lost shall come from the land of Assyria, and the outcast from the land of Egypt." In Hebrew, "Ba'u avdim me'eretz Ashur v'anedechim me'eretz Mitzrayim." And this is what he wrote and how he interpreted it. There are those considered outcast, nidachim. An outcast is someone merely displaced from his place to a faraway location, but he remains recognizable and visible. However, an oved, lost, is someone who is entirely lost, no longer seen or recognized. The suffering now is so great, as beards are simply cut off, Jews' external appearance is no longer recognizable. Due to the intense persecution, even their inner essence is no longer recognizable until the person himself is lost within. He no longer knows who he is, how he felt last year on Shabbat, or even on weekends before prayer and during prayer. This is now gone. He is trampled and crushed to the point that he no longer feels whether he is a Jew, a human being, or a beast without any sense of self-awareness. This is the state of being lost, as it said, "And the lost shall come." In analyzing those two testimonies, I would like to emphasize three crucial points. First, and we can elaborate this later, this crisis extended beyond the individual and affect also the whole family, including wife and children. And we have numerous testimonies describing the emotional devastation of not being able to recognize their loved ones after the forced removal of their beards. Secondly, Orthodox Jews, who had always defined themselves through their visible adherence to Jewish practice, were suddenly forced to relinquish those markers. This was a phenomenon distinct from the experience of other Jews at the time. While many were humiliated by being forced to overtly identify as Jews through those Jewish badges, Orthodox Jews experienced the humiliation of being forced to shade the very symbols that had always identified them as Jewish. From them, this was not just physical. This violation was not just physical, but existential. And third, this also created a communal rupture. Something fundamental changed in the fabric of communal life the moment the community no longer looked Jewish. This rift is poignantly reflected in the words of Natan Koninsky, who described the profound transformation that took place in Kalish during the early stages of the war. Even the outward appearance of Kalish Jewish community changed. Before the war, Jewish community of Kalish included fairly large Orthodox groups. Many Jews in Kalish had beards and sidelocks, and they wore traditional Jewish coats and hats. Those clothes have now almost completely disappeared. You could no longer identify even a single Jew in the street wearing a Jewish hat. Everyone wore caps or flat caps. Due to the many incidents of German soldiers cutting off Jewish beards and sidelocks, those two had mostly vanished. In any case, the Jews shortened their beards and tried to make them as invisible as possible. The loss of Jewish appearance was profoundly distressing for both individual and community. And in the context of refugees and displacement, however, this loss becomes even more destructive. Under normal circumstances, and of course the Holocaust is far from being normal, an Orthodox refugee could typically identify others who share their appearance within the host community, allowing them to find refuge within another Orthodox groups. But what happens when displacement occurs in a reality where people no longer maintain their Orthodox appearance? It is crucial to emphasize that many times the individuals still perceive themselves as having beards, retraining their sense of identity. Yet in the new surroundings, among the community to which they have been expelled, they were unrecognizable, and they themselves couldn't find anyone who resembled the image they hold of their own identity. This painful process is captured in an account of Rabbi Glanter regarding the Jewish population of Skenpi. In the middle of December 1939, an order arrived stating that the Jews from Skenpi must leave the city by December 21st. After that day, no Jews were allowed to be found in the city. It was Shabbat of Hanukkah, and fear and panic spread. The news of the decree to leave the city hit like thunder in the heart. Where could we go in such freezing weather with tiny children, elderly people, and sick? And then the rabbi of the community is trying to strengthen his flock, and he cites different parts of the Jewish writings. For example, לך לך מארצך וממולדתך אל הארץ אשר אראך והיה ברכה. Get thee out of the country unto the land that I will show thee, and be thou be blessing. And he says, I know that nobody shows us to where we'll be deported, and there's no blessing here, but still. He also says that we should help one another, and he's trying to convince the more prominent Jews to support the poor one, saying, כל המרחם לבריות מרחמים עליו מן השמיים. Whoever shows mercy to others, mercy will be shown to them from heaven. And he promised them, I will go to you and I will be with you wherever you will go, citing the last example, for whether thou goest, I will go, and whether thou lodgest, I will lodge. Now the community responded in providing the rabbi with his rabbinical document, which he could use in the future. And I continue to cite from his document. Some say they will travel to the towns around Warsaw, as Warsaw is very expensive, but most believe that it would be better to go directly to Warsaw. Whatever happens to the rest of the Jews will happen to us as well. And they left. In the city, they scattered, one here, another one there. One suddenly know nothing about the other. And so, unfortunately, the entire Jewish community disappeared from the first face of the earth. The end. Now, we could not delve here to Jewish refugees in Poland in the beginning of the war, but this was a widespread phenomenon. Fela Festerman, as an example, described in her diary her town of Belzhice in September 1939. Large numbers of refugees are arriving in our city. They are recounting horrifying stories of how prominent citizens of the city were arrested and burned alive. They also speak of the burning of synagogues, the rape of Jewish women. The refugees abandoned all their belongings and fled to areas they believed would be under Soviet control. And indeed, in her town, nearly half of the Jewish population consisted of refugees. Similar in Piotrków-Trybunalski, and I could give many other small towns example, but even Warsaw had as many as 150,000 refugees, a third of its Jewish population. This brutality and the massive displacement of refugees fundamentally reshaped Jewish communities. While this upheaval was not unique to the Orthodox segment of the Jewish society, studying them offers critical insight into the devastating impact of those initial months, revealing both shared experience and distinct elements. In this context, we might want to remind that although many of those communities were partially rebuilt in the subsequent months before their ultimate destruction by murder, they were fundamentally transformed, often becoming mere shadows of the former selves. Thus, focusing on Orthodox community provides much more than discussing their experience, which of course is important as it is. It illustrates as a prism the profound rupture that the Jewish individual and communal life experienced in the early stages of the German occupation. In our remaining time, I wish to present shortly 3 additional examples of how the study of Orthodox life and community can shed light on broader questions within Holocaust studies: leadership dynamic, experience of Jewish youth, and rescue efforts. Leadership dynamic. In discussing rabbinical leadership during the Holocaust, one might initially focus on some prominent rabbis who managed to leave Nazi-occupied Europe under various circumstances. However, a closer examination revealed that a more complex reality appeared. Out of nearly 2,000 rabbis, the vast majority remained in Nazi-occupied Poland. While there were differences between Hasidic rabbis, yeshiva rabbis, and community rabbis in terms of their ability to flee, the data shows us the following. First, over half of the rabbis stayed in their original communities or returned to them shortly after leaving in the early stages of the war. Secondly, among those who did leave their communities, many relocated to larger cities or nearby communities, often relying on pre-existing relationships or family ties. And third, as the threat of death became more immediate, some rabbis chose to stay with their congregations, while others sought refuge in places that they believed could be safer. An illustrative example of this communal transformation is Rabbi Yechiel Teitelbaum, the elder rabbi of Kolboshova. Now, why the old rabbi? Well, before the war, much before the war, the leadership of the community's rabbinate was embroiled in internal conflicts driven by personal and communal struggle. Ultimately, the young Rabbi Teitelbaum was chosen as rabbi. However, when he emigrated to the United States in the 20s, those struggles restarted again. They became so intense that in 1929, a legal ruling from a court in Lvov, a Polish court in Lvov, confirmed Rabbi Yechiel's authority and forbade another rabbi, Mandel Rubin, from challenging him, particularly in matters concerning marriage and other communal responsibility, though some other duties were left to Rabbi Rubin. This conflict was not merely a matter of honor, but also one of financial survival, as the position of a rabbi was a primary meaning of livelihood. And what happened during the war? As Norman Salzitz recount, the Judenrat paid a small salary to the community rabbi as well as to Rabbi Mandel, the Dayan, judge, but not officially, because officially neither they nor their position existed. Both rabbis remained with the community almost until the end, as their livelihood were tied to the community. Both were murdered in 1942. Rabbi Yechiel Teitelbaum killed in his own town, and Rabbi Rubin murdered after attempting to find refuge in another place. So, what can we learn from this case and from other rabbis about the Jewish leadership during the Holocaust? I believe quite a lot. First, in many communities, there were multiple rabbis and sometimes no official rabbi at all. Secondly, prayer war tension persisted in some cases during the Holocaust, while in others they did not. Third, in this case, and this is by no means unique, despite the community's limited resources during the Holocaust, it supported both rabbis, even if not officially. Fourth, local leadership, with religious leadership being just one example, often remained with their communities almost until the very end. Complicated? For sure. But examining rabbis as leader highlights that Jewish leadership during the Holocaust is far more complicated than just the question of Judenrats. Jewish communities, large and small, had multiple layers of leadership, including rabbis, community officials, party members, philanthropic institution activists, and more. Moreover, focusing on those rabbis underscores the importance of linking the Holocaust research to pre-war period and the need to deepen our study of smaller communities. Let's move to Jewish youth, or Orthodox Jews, it should be. Extensive scholarship has been dedicated to secular youth movement during the Holocaust, yet it is equally essential to recognize the significant contribution of Orthodox youth, whose action often focused on preserving religious life despite the horrors surrounding them. A powerful example for this is Pearl Beinish and a group of 10 young women, 9 of whom were graduates of Beth Yaakov School, who organized themselves as a supportive network in Krakow, Plaszow, Auschwitz, and Bergen-Belsen. These women, which were known as a Zennerschaft, age 16 to 24, demonstrated remarkable resilience, fostering the sense of community and purpose even under the extreme conditions of the ghetto and camps. Fegel from Vilnius ghetto and Adasta Pasterman from Zavrice further exemplify this religious leadership. Those women gathered others around them, leading and teaching even the most dire circumstances, exemplifying how young religious leaders could emerge amid the brutality. Though their effort ultimately cost their life and many details of their activities remain unknown, their legacy of strength and spiritual resistance endure. One of the most notable figures in Orthodox youth leadership during the Holocaust was Matthias Matityahu Gelman. Originally from Vienna and raised in a secular household, Gelman became deeply connected to the Hasidic community in Poland even as a young boy. In 1934, at the age of 16, he even ran away from home in an attempt to join the Ger Hasidic movement, despite his father's firm opposition. Prior to the war, Gelman studied at the renewed Yeshiva of Lublin, Yeshivat Chachmei Lublin, and developed a close relationship with the Ger Rebbe. Now, I have to go back to the period before the war. Between the two world wars, the Ger Rebbe, concerned about the influence of secular movement on Hasidic youth, established an organization to nurture young members of his community, led by youth leaders, he called them Kommendantim, and promoting the Hasidic way of life. Gelman was a prominent member of those groups and became, before the war, one of its most impressive leaders, one of the most impressive Kommendanten. As the war broke out, Gelman revived those youth groups, organizing and traveling between various cities such as Warsaw, Krakow, Lodz, Będzin, Sosnowiec, and Stechowa, Tarnów, Radom, Kielce, and numerous smaller communities throughout the Generalgouvernement. He must have used not only his charisma, but also his fluent German. Under his inspiration, groups of Hasidic youngsters were reformed, maintaining the Hasidic appearance and a way of life, even in the midst of the terrifying reality of the Holocaust, and despite the significant dangers associated with visible identifying as Jewish, as discussed earlier. Ephraim Ludner captured the dedication of those young men in his memoir. I'm sorry, this I wanted to show before. This is a very unique picture of Gelman, of Matis Gelman, standing near the Gur Rebbe. Matis Gelman and the Gur Rebbe. In my heart, I envied them for their innocence, for their wondrous simplicity with which they served the Creator, for their Hasidic way of thinking that did not change in the slightest, even in the days of destruction. They behaved exactly as they did in the days before the war in Gur. I, on the other hand, and many like me, succumbed to the pressure of the time when the war broke out, cut off my beard and sidelock, for it was a matter of life and death, and the rabbis ruled to act accordingly, and changed my Hasidic clothing to modern attire. But this Hasidic group, they did not change, neither in their inner self nor in their outward appearance. Those groups were known as Matishovitzim, named after Matis Gelman, and operated in distinctly different manner from other Orthodox Jews. They refused to compromise on even the smallest aspect of Hasidic life, even in the cost of their life. And those two young men that you can see here were photographed by the German after being subjected to abuse, were part of the Matisovichin group in Zavricha. Naturally, with the destruction of the Jewish communities, those groups also disappeared. They kept their traditional appearance. They could not hide anymore. Matthias himself, and we know this thanks to the record of the ITS archive, was eventually captured while visiting one of his groups in Radom. He was deported to Auschwitz, where he was murdered less than a month later. I have presented this topic only briefly, and there are numerous additional aspects of Orthodox Jewish activity that could be explored in greater details. However, beyond the research gaps regarding those groups, their stories raise broader questions. For instance, there were notable gender differences in the way those groups operated, a pattern observed not only among Orthodox Jews, and we can elaborate about it later. Another important factor is the geographical aspect. Those two young individuals mentioned earlier, much like Hadassah Passerman, were from Zavrice, while Krakow saw the emergence of both pro-Albanish group and the one of the more active of Matisovichin group led by Yanchi Geffen. In fact, a deeper investigation into the geographical dimension of Orthodox Jewish activities revealed significant regional differences under Nazi occupation, different trends that might also apply to non-Orthodox Jewish movements. Once again, this discussion of Orthodox Jews raises numerous questions that have not only been overlooked in traditional Holocaust studies, but also contribute to broader, more complex questions. The third brief example I would like to address is the role of Orthodox Jewry in acts of rescue during the Holocaust, which challenged one of the prevailing myths about this community. Michael Zilberberg, who was not Orthodox, wrote, "I often think of those religious people now as they live in false identity as a Polish Catholic. Their unique way of life separates them from their surroundings until they all vanished in their tens of thousands, and their hundreds of thousands went up in smoke of the extermination camps." However, as previously discussed, the visible appearance of Orthodox Jews diminished in the early months of the war, even if their existence persisted in various forms. The narrative of their helplessness is therefore not only incomplete, but also misleading. Actually, this museum collection provides evidence of an Orthodox organized rescue efforts, such as that of Ben Zion Kalb, who was involved in smuggling numerous Jews from Poland to Slovakia. Thanks to the research done by Judy Cohen, we have a clear understanding of how individuals like Kalb played a crucial role in saving life, and I could give examples of other Orthodox networks of Geller and others who acted in a similar way. Beyond those organized efforts, individual stories of courage also emerge. One of such examples is the story of Shifra Myrens, born in Rzeszów to Rabbi Tuvia and Ita Horvitz. While I will not delve into the entire history of this family here, it is worth noting that her collection, preserved in the museum, including letters, diaries, and photos, reveal the remarkable courage and boldness of this young Orthodox woman. Shifra, the eldest of four children, moved with her family to Sanok around 1932, where her father served as a town rabbi. In 1938, she married Nehemiah Meirans, and the couple relocated to Lodz. As you can see, they were deeply rooted within the Orthodox community. Yet during the war, and now with a young daughter, Shifra lived under false identity. Most of the time, her husband had to hide because of his more Jewish appearance, and did all she could to help her family survive through, though not always was successful in it. Now, securing false identity was an incredible complex task for all, not just for Orthodox Jews. However, for Orthodox Jews, there was an additional layer of complicity due to the religious principle of Yehareg ve'bal yavor, the obligation to die rather than transgress certain commandments. Orthodox Jews had to grapple with the question of whether, from a religious perspective, it was permissible to disguise themselves as Catholic. In Shifra's case, her father, the rabbi, provided her with a guidance and religious ruling, as she recalled in her diary, and the diary is kept here in the museum. In order to say, this is what her father told her, in order to save one's life, one is entitled to resort to many things which would be unforgivable in different circumstances, except for three. Here he outlined the three commandments that must not be violated under any circumstances, one of which is a prohibition against idolatry, avodah zarah, which could, in theory, include living under false identity as a Catholic. However, her father argued that the Jewish law question is a different one, and he said, your and your child's life depends on a certain lie, which will hurt no one, that you are allowed to lie, particularly since it's for a certain time only. You should live for our sake as well, because since we don't know how things will turn out here, you may be able to help us later. I'm not sure I can fully convey just how heartbreaking such a ruling would be for an Orthodox rabbi. Nevertheless, it seems that for some it was easier said than done. As she wrote in a diary about her brother Mendek, she said Mendek would rather die than consent to this type of life. Unfortunately, this is precisely what happened. When she attempted to move her siblings, a brother and two sisters, to a safer location, her brother refused to shave his beard, leading to his capture and murder. However, even family members who did alter their appearance did not necessarily survive, as was the case of one of her sisters, her mother, and her father, the rabbi. Shifra, however, was able to successfully protect her daughter husband, young sister, mother-in-law, and 2 brothers-in-law. This story, like other, highlights the complicity of survival strategies during the dark chapter of this history and challenge the notion of myth of passivity among religious Jews, whether through organized smuggling networks or as personal acts of bravery. So, what can we learn from the discussion on Orthodox Jewish life during the Holocaust, particularly regarding the initial stages of occupation, as well as leadership, youth, and rescue attempts? A number of things, I believe. The critical role of the early months of the war in shattering Jewish society and individual life, the impact of physical appearance in the context of displacement and its influence on survival, the presence of multiple layers of Jewish leadership during the Holocaust, including religious, communal, and youth leaders, the importance of linking Holocaust research to pre-war period for more comprehensive understanding, the need to focus on smaller, often overlooked Jewish communities in Holocaust research, the significance of gender differences in experience and responses during the Holocaust, the influence of regional differences in Jewish survival strategies under Nazi occupation, and debunking myth as the one of Jewish passivity during the Holocaust, and I could go on. But what we can see, those are just some of the outcomes that emerge when we fully integrate the experience of Orthodox life into the study of the Holocaust. Last but not the least, all of those observations are grounded in a wide range of sources, some from wartime accounts, others from specific religious documents, such as the early testaments provided in rabbinical quotes after the war to permit Jewish women to marry. Those agunot, this one is taken, of course, from the museum, is one of the earliest testimonies collected by rabbis in DP camps and other places. Additional information can be found in later testimonies, including those preserved in the invaluable Yizkor books. And what about the visual documentation? Well, these photographs survived thanks to Mr. Noman Salzitz, a young man who documented Jewish life during the Holocaust with his own camera. His collection, preserved in the museum, not only captured the internal aspect of Jewish life, which he photographed himself, but also included images taken by German soldiers, photos he obtained from the Polish developer of his own photograph. One of such images depict a German soldier standing in the center of the synagogue, a humiliation of another prominent religious figure, half hidden by the other picture, and a third is a documentation of Rabbi Teitelbaum. The survival of those images and the testimonies remind us of the crucial role that survivors play in enabling us to understand the Holocaust. This lecture is therefore dedicated to both victims and survivors of the Holocaust, emphasizing the importance of fully integrating Orthodox Jewish experience into our study of this tragic period. Unveiling the Unexplored Orthodox Jews in Poland is an ongoing mission. Thank you very much.
Havi, thank you so much. It's just so wonderful that you're here, despite this extremely heavy and difficult topic. I'm just so happy that we're here and we're able to do this.
Thank you, Betsy.
Good team. Before I get started, I'll remind you that I think you were given 3x5 cards as you walked in, and you can use them to write your questions for Havi. Pass them to the end, and our colleagues will collect them and bring them to me. Excuse me. So Havi, I work at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. You know that. I hear and I read and I see horrible things all the time. The way you have put these words and these images together, it brought me back. It brought me back to the core of of the inhumanity of all of this. And I had the benefit of speaking with you earlier more about the images that you chose and how you used them. And I have the benefit of knowing from our conversation that you chose to crop some of the images and to obscure some things. So I think to get our discussion started, and as we wait for some other questions, I wonder if you'd comment on that. Tell us more about the choices you make as a scholar to choose the images, to choose the words that you present.
Well, first of all, the topic is really very, very difficult. And this is a question I'm all the time struggling, writing as well as presenting this work. Because I'm all the time asking myself, and I'm constantly asking myself, how on one hand I'm showing the atrocities as they were, and I think we are obligated to talk about those horrible details. And on the other hand, making sure that I'm keeping the dignity of those Jews. And this is very difficult, especially in this topic, because humiliating those people is part of the story I must tell. And I think that without it, the devastation of the Jewish community's life and personal life in the beginning of the war will not be apparent. But on the other side, I'm talking about people that I want to keep and to honor their dignity. So as you said, there are two photos which I showed only partially on this presentation. One of them of two men who are not only violated in their beards, but also were forced to take off their pants or something. So I brought only the first part. And the other picture that I brought in a very small way and half covered of that another person that we know who he is, that was humiliated in Kolboshova and photographed by the Germans. And here is my major problem regarding this issue, because when we're talking about the harm, hurting the rabbi of this or that community, the community knows who that rabbi was. When I used to work on Warsaw Ghetto and during the uprising, and I had horrible testimonies, it was of anonymous people, so I could use different tactics of presenting it. But here I'm all the time struggling, and I must admit that any word that you could see in those documents, 3 dots, or I jump and just describe something, it is because I felt that giving the exact description would be unhonorable to those people. And this is something I'm trying. I'm not sure I'm always succeeding, but I'm trying to do the best I can.
I think you're succeeding. You're definitely preserving their dignity and respecting them. I wanted to also ask about the gender aspect. At a certain point, you were talking about the Jewish, the Orthodox youth movements, and you referred to gender patterns through the Orthodox youth movements, but also the non-Orthodox ones. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that now. You mentioned you might.
Yeah, so I'll tell you 2 things. First of all, in the Orthodox youth movements, youth groups, it's not always movements. It's very simple because there were no men and women in the same group. And it's very clear about that. But that made me think and re-examine some of the more known example of other youth movements. And then you can see that although there is this myth of socialist youth movement that men and women were equal and did the same things, in practice, it didn't really work that way. So that is one thing. Another thing that we can learn, and that is one thing, but I must admit that I have a great challenge with the gender aspect, because most of my documents, the vast majority, refer to men and not to women. And some of the reasons are quite understandable. We had rabbis who were men and not, and I'm trying to refer to their families. And as I mentioned, we have so many testimonies of the wives and of the children, seeing that their father coming with a half beard and so on. And this of course, is a painful time. But you can also see the different structures and the different duties that women and children, young girls are taking on themselves, usually more connected to self-aid and trying to support the davening of the men and so on. Now, from the religious point of view, you can like it or not, the davening of a man is more important than the davening of the woman because he has a commandment. So you can see how there is an enlistment of the family, of the community to try to protect those things, but it's a very big challenge.
I think we have some questions. You anticipated the second part of that question for me.
Yes.
So this is working. You anticipated that the question, because of course, obviously the images and the words and a lot of what you did share was about men and spoken by men. Not all of it, but
Yes,
a lot of it. And I was going to ask that, why? So thank you. We actually have some questions from the audience now. So, how did rabbis deal with kashrut, and did religious Jews keep kosher?
okay. So maybe I will say that, thank you for that question. If I would have had more time, I would have said a few general things about what we know about religious life during the Holocaust, and some of the scholars who deal with topics are sitting here among us. But one of the topics that was quite discussed is a question of commandments, whether they're kept or not. And the problem is that in later testimonies, most religious Jews depicted how they continued to keep all the mitzvot and all the commandments and keep kosher and everything. But when you dig in more, we'll say, unique testimonies, you see that people could not keep kosher during the Holocaust. The vast majority of the people, those Matisovicim that I mentioned before, were a group that really kept their religious practice, and some of them starved to death. But the vast majority did not keep kosher. And I remember once I was hearing this testimony of Shmuel Halpering, a very nice man, and he was giving the testimony to a group of young girls from Bes Yaakov. And he was a frum Jew, short man with a beard, and he told them that he was in Plashov, and suddenly Emon Get came and asked if somebody knows how to cook rabbits, because there is a need in the kitchen. And he raised his hand. He said, well, I didn't know how to cook rabbits, but for sure in the kitchen it's better than working in other places. And then he asked the girls, and there was like 80 girls, Bes Yaakov in front of him. He asked them, he said, I never baked, I never used a rabbit, but I knew what my mother did with a chicken. I did the same, put pepper, salt, whatever they need. And then he asked, and what do you do when you want to know if it's already prepared, if you can serve it? And there's like the silence, like petrified silence. And he's asking again, what should you do if you want to know if something is good or not? And nobody answered. And then he says, you taste it. And they scream, but it's not kosher. And he says, but it was so good. So there is a great difference between the story told years afterwards and what you see in internal accounts, in the early testimonies. And there, the story is much more complicated.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question. Was it more common for the rabbis to be concerned about idolatry in passing as a Catholic rather than concerns about conversion of children?
Okay, so again, this is a very tough question. I will use it just to demonstrate how many problems we have methodologically using trying to understand what was happening. So from the rabbinical point of view, ruling for people to dress themselves as a Christian and behave as Christian, it's a very problematic thing. And this testimony of the Rabbi Horowitz is a very unique one. And one of the interesting sources we have in that case is of a man called Rabbi Avigdor, who wrote 2 books. In the first one, he says that people came to him, mainly young women, and asked if they can flee and run and live as Christian. And he said this was very important because they knew that if we will rule in a certain way, we will be accused of helping the German and so on. And he tells this whole story. And in his other accounts, and both of our accounts are written right after the war, one of 49 and 151, he says, me and my rabbinical court sat the whole night and discussed this issue, and I cannot tell you what we ruled. Now, if he would have ruled that it was forbidden, he would have written it. That's quite obvious. It seems as if this wasn't forbidden from his point of view, but he cannot write it. Halacha and Morton is a term in the religious ruling. So it was very difficult for rabbis to rule, and it was very complicated in sense of to rule to others and to rule to yourself. Sometimes a rabbi ruled to others, go and hide yourself, but for themselves they rule differently. And I'll give just one example because I know there are more questions. There is this Yitzhak Levin. Yitzhak Levin was the son of the rabbi from Lvov, Yechezkel Levin, and his father was killed in the very first days of the occupation of Lvov. And he's going to the hegemon of the Catholic, to the Uniatic, to the Shpetitsky, who is the highest Christian authority, Ukrainian authority, and ask for his help. And this Shpetitsky says, I can hide you and your brothers. And he goes to his mother and asks to smuggle his two younger brothers, and his mother refuses. And she says, we're from a destiny of rabbis. I cannot give my children away because I don't know what will happen. And then he takes his younger brother, Natan, who is 9 years old, and smuggled to those Christian institution. When he comes to take his 4-year-old brother, his mother says, well, I know what you did with Natan, but he's old enough, and I'm sure that you are old enough and you'll remember that you're Jewish, but I cannot send Lebush. This cannot happen. And she and her son perished both in horrible ways later on. So the question of ruling to yourself and to others, children, men, women, very complicated and very heartbreaking.
Absolutely. But a good question and a good to think about. So this question comes from the audience, but it's one that I share. You shared so many fascinating primary sources. I'm also intrigued by the methods you used to make sense of them as you delved into this history. Could you please share more about the spreadsheet you used that you shared on one of the images of your slides, and how that factored into your work?
Okay, so that spreadsheet is a list of almost 2,000 rabbis, Polish rabbis. I have a larger list of people who were documented as rabbi in the Hall of Names of Yad Vashem, but as you can see, many times people had a title of rabbi but did not act as a rabbi. So there is a difference in that. And I just got the information, sometimes that is the information that comes from different sources, and some of them are from the work of Tina Meislish, who did a very detailed catalog of rabbis years ago. Now, it is one of the problematic things is that so that is a spreadsheet, and I tried to understand different things about those rabbis, if they stayed, if they fled, where did they flee, and so on. But regarding to sources, maybe I should add another aspect, and that is reading Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox documents. One has to have a very careful ear because the language many times is different. And it's not only the language spoken, but how terms are phrased. And I'll give just that example. I told you about it earlier, but there was this testimony of a nice gentleman that I was listening to, and the interviewer asked this gentleman if they had guests coming to their home before the war. And he said, guests? We never had guests in our house. We never, no guests. And she went on interviewing him, and then later on he told her that every Shabbos evening when his father would return from the synagogue, he would bring people with him to dine and join the Shabbos evening. And she said, so you had guests? And he said, guests? Those were not guests. They just came to eat with us. They were not guests in any means. So many times the language, many times I find myself needing to read in different ways what is written, because the language is different, the question is different. And maybe here I should say that there is a very important role of ultra-Orthodox researcher and of ultra-Orthodox institutions, some of which are collaborating with the museum, who are collecting testimonies of those people, because many times they won't answer to my question. And many times people from their community will answer better those questions. And just one one last example of how different things are. There is this diary. I think it's an amazing diary. I never read it because it wasn't handed to any one of the institutions, written by a man who was a prominent Orthodox figure and who at one point hid in the Aryan side in Warsaw, was caught during the Polish uprising and sent to Dachau. And in Dachau, he survived being pretending to be a Catholic priest. And he wrote a diary. And the diary exists, and his daughter has a diary, but she wouldn't give the diary to anybody. Now, I all the time thought that she didn't want to give the diary because she didn't want everybody to know that her father, that was a frum Jew, passed away as a Catholic priest. But later on, there was another attempt, and the problem was, from her point of view, that she doesn't read Polish, and the diary is in Polish, and she was afraid that her father might have said bad things, leshon hara, on other Jews in the diary, and she didn't want anybody to have her father's leshon hara, and since she couldn't read it, she didn't want anybody else to read it, and she wasn't willing. She still, I'm not sure she's still with us, but we don't have the diary. So this is just one example of how complicated it is and how important the work of ultra-Orthodox scholars is.
Absolutely, thank you. Okay, something a little different. The Germans devoted a great deal of effort to cemetery desecration. Why did they care so much? Do you see this as specifically anti-religious in nature, or is there something else, something larger?
Well, I think this is a good example to see how harming religious symbols, or what can be seen as religious symbols, because a graveyard is not only religious symbols, had a profound and devastating impact on the whole community. Because we have, first of all, graveyards were a very important place during the Holocaust too. And one of the chapter of the book that I should be finished writing if I didn't have so many other problems. One of them is Jewish Orthodox reactions. One of the Orthodox reactions was to go to graveyards and pray, hoping that praying on the graves of our forefathers will help and change something. So the graveyards were an important place during the Holocaust. The Germans had their reasons, and we could see it's many times, as in Plaszow, it's trying to humiliate the Jews and so on. But this had a devastating effect on religious and non-religious Jews the same. I could say that if people from a specific Hasidut saw how the Germans are harming the specific grave of their, maybe it was a little bit more, but I don't think that a secular, at least I didn't see a secular testimony, a Jewish testimony saying, oh, they ran over the graveyard and I don't care about it. And actually, even when those rabbis were humiliated in that sense, people who were not part of their community felt shattered. So this also shows how many times discussing different communities should be much more merged and complicated.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting in your talk when you talked about, on one hand, the outward appearance of an Orthodox Jewish man was something that the Nazis were ripping away, literally, or burning away, or cutting away, but which then would leave them looking like everybody else. But then the more secular Jews that already looked like everybody else, they needed to stick a badge on so they could mark who they were. And I thought it was just a really striking way that you put those two things together to think about that, how the two communities and the different groups work together. It's all part of the same history, obviously.
Maybe I'll give you an example outside of Poland. In Germany, after the burning of the Kristallnacht, there is this, I'll remember his name in a second, Zeigler, I think, Rabbi Zeigler, who was a liberal rabbi, saying, well, now when there's not so many synagogues left, now all the Jewish different segments, the liberal and the Orthodox, must pray in the same synagogues, and finally we're all united, and this never happened before. And we have a same testimony of an Orthodox rabbi saying, for years we're trying to keep away from the liberals, not to pray with them at the same place, not to be at the same place. And now our strategy is that we have to be in the same place. So many times those are really different point of view, some of the things. And for me, it was heartbreaking to see how they wanted to continue identify as Jews and actually feel almost naked when their beards are taken off.
It's so personal. Javi, thinking about you working on this topic when you're undergoing the treatment you were dealing with.
Thanks God, it was a different story.
Can't imagine. Yes, thank God. Okay.
And I'm
Let's
okay.
see. Have a little bit more time. So one of our visitors, one of our guests, has been reading. I can't read the handwriting. I'm sorry. But Journey Through the Pale and Galicia in 1914, 1917. Many stories seem similar. Do you see continuity?
Of former events of...
Yeah. Do you see continuity from interwar time or
World
War I time?
Was there violence against religious Jews prior to the Holocaust? Of course, pogroms and things like that. I think it might resemble those really early weeks and months. Later on, of course, it's a different story. I need to think this question a little bit better because some of the aspects for sure resemble. We have many rapes at the beginning of the war. We have those brutal things. Later on, it will be different. Jews are using the term pogrom during the war itself, but these two evaded as time's gone. But I need to think it over. I think that will be two different contexts, but maybe comparing them can raise some interesting questions. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Okay, coming back to the youth groups. Can you expand upon the links between Orthodox youth groups and those factions of other political persuasions, such as communists or Bundists? Did Orthodox smuggling networks coordinate their actions as part of a larger resistance network? So two different questions, actually.
Okay, so I'll try to answer both of them. First of all, I'll give one example. Krakow, unlike other places, there was this big explosion of Jews in the second half of year 1940, which caused many Jews who were in Krakow. Krakow at the beginning of the war had 60,000 Jews, and then the German forced about 40,000 of them to just find them somewhere else. When you trace those Matisovichim, you see that because of this expulsion in the beginning of the war, many different places were now gaining power from those people who came from Krakow. So there is this expulsion from Krakow, and then many places, those cells are being established. And when you look on similar activists, secular activists who were expelled, you can see similar things. So that is just one example. That is one thing. And the other question was?
About Orthodox smuggling networks?
Did they coordinate in any way? Well, definitely no, there was no connection. I'll say even more. The first man who wrote about Matisovichim was Prager, Moshe Prager, who wrote about it in the 60s, early 60s. He wrote a book in which he depicted those Matisovichim and so on. And when this book was published, it was harshly criticized by historians, Natan Eck from Yad Vashem, saying that this man is trying to impose a religious youth group of something that never existed, and this is why he's using those terms and so on. A very, very harsh criticism. I must admit that for years, and if someone will look at my earlier article, I even had one that I said that this is an example for what is called ultra-Orthodox historiography, just how you adopt the notions from different things and so on. It sounds so weird that I didn't think that this establishment did exist. But digging into it, it's amazing to see the story of Mattis Gelman and of the many groups he made, but there was no connection that I am aware of. What you can find connection, but that is something that Judy Cohen already pointed out, is the network of Ben Zion Kalb. And Ben Zion Kalb, who smuggled Jews, mainly Orthodox Jews, but not only, was in contact with Yitzhak Zuckerman and Tzivi Lubetkin at 1944, offering them to smuggle the border, and they answered him, and the note is here in the museum, the original note is here in the museum. They answered him saying that we cannot smuggle ourselves, leaving the rest of the community behind. If there is a solution to smuggle, it should be something differently, so on. So there was some connection, but not of those Matisovichim. They were so zealous, they were so extreme, they didn't have connection not only to secular, but even to more moderate, ultra-Orthodox groups.
Thank you so much, Havi. I'm going to have to tell Judy Cohen how much nice attention she's gotten from you this evening.
She deserves that.
And
as many other friends
she does
do.
deserve it. And thank you so much for being here with us, for coming back so that we could honor you and hear about your work. And now, please, I hope you'll all join me in welcoming Havi upstairs for a reception and a chance to speak with our special guest. Havi, thank you so much.
Thank you.